Okay, let's picture this. November 9th, 1989. You're seeing these images, right? Ordinary people, not soldiers, with hammers chipping away at the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, it's an incredible image.
And it wasn't just concrete falling. It was this huge symbol of the Cold War division literally being torn down.
Absolutely. And as dramatic as that was, the source material we're diving into makes it clear this was really a massive catalyst.
A catalyst. How so?
Well, that wall coming down triggered this huge chain reaction across Eastern Europe. It ultimately led to the collapse of what they called the Second World.
And that reshaped everything.
Completely. In ways we're, still dealing with today.
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive then, to really unpack that incredible period. We want to get into the meaning, the core causes behind it all.
And the consequences, too. Those profound, lasting consequences of the Soviet Union just disintegrating. What happened afterwards in those countries?
And how did other places, maybe like India, fit into this new, shifting world order?
Exactly. We've gathered a good amount of source material to guide us through this. It's full of insights, facts. It helps us understand not just what happened, but why.
And why it still matters.
Right.
Why you, listening, should care.
Definitely. We'll try to cut through the complexity, pull out the really important takeaways for you.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something this huge? The source suggests we need to understand the Second World itself first. Could go back to the roots.
Yeah, tracing the USSR back to 1917, the Russian Revolution. Born out of socialist ideals set against capitalism, aiming for this idea of an egalitarian society.
But with very specific structure.
A very specific structure. The source highlights the absolute primacy of the state and the Communist Party right from the start.
So the economy was planned.
Totally planned and controlled by the state. And crucially, no other political parties allowed. It was a single-party system, top-down.
Okay, so that's the USSR core. But the Second World was bigger than just the Soviet Union itself.
Right. The source defines it as basically those East European countries, places where the Soviet army ended up after World War II.
And they came under Soviet control.
Pretty much, yeah. Their political systems, their economic systems, they were all modeled directly on the USSR's.
And they were all bound together somehow.
By the Warsaw Pact. That was the military alliance keeping this socialist bloc, as they called it, together, with the USSR as the leader, obviously.
Now, thinking about the USSR itself right after the war.
Yeah.
The source paints a picture of a major power.
Oh, absolutely. A great power. Its economy, actually more developed than most places, except maybe the U.S.
It had complex communications, vast energy resources.
Huge resources. Oil, iron, steel, machinery production, transport that worked. On the surface, at least.
And the state provided a basic standard of living.
Yeah, the source notes that it ensured a minimum level. The government subsidized essentials like health, education, childcare, welfare. Officially, no unemployment.
And ownership.
State ownership dominated everything. Land, productive assets. It was pretty much all state-controlled.
And the source mentions the key leaders who shaped this over time. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. They're important contexts.
Definitely. They steered how this specific model developed. But what's really striking is how, despite that initial strength, cracks started showing.
Internal weaknesses.
Big ones. The system, aiming for equality, became really bureaucratic and deeply authoritarian. Life got difficult for ordinary people.
That lack of democracy, freedom of speech, the source says it was stifling.
Totally stifling. It mentions dissent often came out through things like jokes and cartoons. You know that potato harvest joke in the source?
Oh, yeah, tell it.
Okay, so a party official asks a farmer about the potato harvest. The farmer says, "By the grace of God, we had mounds of potatoes." The official, being a good party man, says, "But, comrade, there is no God."
And the farmer replies,
"Huh. And there are no mountains of potatoes either."
Shuckles. Yeah, that says a lot about the gap between propaganda and reality.
Exactly. And the party itself in power for over 70 years. It had this tight grip, wasn't accountable to the people at all.
And it ignored the republics wanting more control.
Completely ignored it. The source points out Russia dominated everything, even though it was technically just one republic out of 15. Other regions felt neglected, even suppressed.
Economically, too, things started to slide.
Yeah. They tried to match the U.S. in the arms race. Sometimes they did, but the cost was huge. They fell behind the West in technology, infrastructure like transport, power.
And just fulfilling what citizens wanted.
They really failed there, politically and economically. Then the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, that just weakened the system even more.
Productivity dropped, technology lagged.
Yep. led to constant shortages of consumer goods. People couldn't get basic things. Food imports just kept going up every year. By the late 70s, the economy was really faltering, stagnant.
So things are looking pretty grim. Then someone new comes along.
Right. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. He became general secretary in 1985. And the source frames his goal as trying to reform the system.
He saw they were falling behind.
He did. Especially with the information and tech revolutions happening in the West, he knew something had to change.
And his big policies. We always hear perestroika and glasnost.
Those are the key ones. Perestroika, that was about restructuring the economy, the bureaucracy, trying to make it work better.
And glasnost?
Glasnost means openness. So, introducing some freedom of speech, easing up on censorship. He also wanted democratization inside the USSR, and, crucially, decided to normalize relations with the West.
Okay, now this is where, according to the source, things get really unpredictable. These reforms had massive unintended effects.
Huge unintended effects, especially outside the Soviet Union itself.
How so?
Well, as Gorbachev talked openness and seemed less aggressive, people in those East European countries, the socialist bloc, they saw their chance.
They started protesting.
Yes, against their own governments and, importantly, against Soviet control.
And the big difference this time compared to, say, Hungary in '56 or Czechoslovakia in '68.
This is critical, and the source really emphasizes it. Gorbachev did not intervene. Unlike previous leaders who sent tanks, he let them go.
Wow. And the result?
Stunningly fast. One after another, those communist regimes just collapsed across Eastern Europe.
Bringing us back to that image.
Back to the Berlin Wall. November 9, 1989. Broken down by the people themselves after standing for 28 years. That moment wasn't just about Germany unifying.
It was the symbolic end.
It really marked the beginning of the end for the whole communist bloc. The end of that divided Europe.
And the source shows this feeds back into the USSR itself. These events abroad sped things up at home.
Absolutely. It hastened the disintegration within the Soviet Union. Plus, Gorbachev's reforms were facing serious opposition from hardliners inside the Communist Party.
People who liked the old system.
Exactly. Which led to that attempted coup in August 1991, staged by those hardliners.
That failed.
It failed. The source suggests it's because people by then had experienced some freedom under glasnost. They'd tasted freedom, as the source puts it, and resisted going back.
And a key figure emerged during that coup attempt.
Boris Yeltsin. He famously stood on a tank, opposed the coup, became a national hero. Then he won a popular election in the Russian Republic itself.
Which must have shifted the power balance dramatically.
Fundamentally, power started draining away from the Central Soviet government in Moscow. It shifted to the republics, especially the European one.
Yeah.
Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, who started acting like sovereign states.
What about the Central Asian republics?
Interestingly, the source notes they initially seemed maybe more willing to stay in some kind of reformed union.
But that's not what happened.
No. In December 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus got together and declared the Soviet Union was finished. Disbanded.
Just like that?
Pretty much. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned. They decided to adopt capitalism and democracy instead.
And Russia stepped into the USSR's international role.
Yes. Russia was accepted as the successor state, took the UN Security Council seat, inherited the treaties, became the sole nuclear power left from the old Union.
And the Central Asian republics, who weren't part of that initial declaration.
They were apparently quite surprised at first, but then they quickly joined this new entity, the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS.
So the old Soviet Union was gone.
Dead and buried is the phrase the source uses. Stark, but accurate.
Which circles back to that big question, how did the world's second superpower just dissolve so quickly, it seemed?
Yeah, it's baffling from the outside. The source points out, though, that political systems do collapse. It's not the first, won't be the last. Maybe there are general lessons here.
And the main reason the source identifies.
It really comes down to the internal weaknesses. Those political and economic institutions just weren't working anymore. They failed to meet people's aspirations.
We talked about the economic stagnation, the shortages that must have eroded faith.
Completely. Years of that created real public doubt, but the source pushes deeper. Why did the system get so weak? Part of it was the sheer economic burden.
Like the arms race.
The arms race, yes, that was a massive drain. But also propping up satellite states in Eastern Europe and trying to fund development across the huge Soviet territory, especially in Central Asia. The system just couldn't sustain it all.
And knowing about the West played a part.
Definitely. The source calls it a political and psychological shock. People became more aware of how much further ahead the West was economically, realizing their own system's backwardness was, well, devastating after decades of being told it was superior.
And politically, that rigidity we mentioned.
Right. The source calls it administrative and political stagnation. The party was unaccountable after 70 years. Suffocating bureaucracy, corruption, couldn't correct mistakes, wouldn't allow real openness.
And it was all run from the center.
Hugely centralized. Plus, party officials had privileges that really alienated ordinary people, so the government lost popular support. People just didn't feel connected to it anymore.
Okay, but Gorbachev tried to fix these things, right? Reform the economy, open things up. Yet the whole thing collapsed while he was trying. Did the reforms cause the collapse? That's a key question the source raises.
It's a really tricky one. The source suggests his diagnosis was probably right. The system needed reform. But by opening the door, he let loose forces, expectations that just couldn't be controlled.
Like people wanting change faster.
Exactly. Some felt he wasn't going fast enough. Their lives weren't improving quickly. They got impatient, disappointed.
And the other side.
The hardliners, the bureaucrats, they saw their power and perks slipping away. They thought he was going way too fast, destroying the system.
So he was caught in the middle.
Pretty much. The source argues he ended up losing support from both sides. Even people who initially backed him felt he wasn't decisive enough, maybe, against the hardliners.
But even with all that, the weak system, the reform problems, the source points to one final immediate trigger for the actual disintegration.
Yes. The rise of nationalism and this powerful desire for sovereignty within the republics themselves.
And this wasn't just in one or two places.
No, it surged across the board. Russia itself, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, others too. The source calls this the final and most immediate cause for the breakup in 91.
And there are different views on why nationalism surged then. Was it always there, or did Gorbachev unleash it?
Yeah, that's a debate the source touches on. Was it bound to happen eventually? Or did Gorbachev's policies, by relaxing control, specifically fan the flames of these nationalist feelings until they couldn't be contained?
There's an irony noted in the source, too, isn't there? About where the nationalism was strongest.
Right. During the Cold War, a lot of analysts in the West expected trouble in Central Asia. Different ethnicities, religions, less developed economies.
But that wasn't where the main push came from.
No. The source says the strongest nationalist dissatisfaction actually emerged in the more European, relatively more prosperous parts. Russia, the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia.
Why there?
The feeling grew, according to the source, that they were not only controlled by Moscow, but also that they were essentially subsidizing the less developed, mainly Central Asian parts of the Union. They felt they were paying too high an economic price and would be better off alone.
So the collapse wasn't just the end of the USSR. It had these huge global consequences. What were the big ones the source highlights?
It points to three broad, really profound changes. First, the most obvious one, the end of the Cold War itself.
That whole ideological battle, socialism versus capitalism, was over.
Done. And with it, the arms race, the nuclear standoff, the opposing military blocs, all that ended, which the source notes created at least the possibility of a new era of peace.
Okay, second big change.
A fundamental shift in global power. The question went from a bipolar U.S.-Soviet world to, what now? Unipolar, the U.S. on top, or multipolar with several powers?
And the outcome?
The source confirms the outcome was effectively a unipolar moment. The U.S. became the sole superpower.
A dominant economic system.
Capitalism. Backed by U.S. power and prestige, it became the default international model. Institutions like the World Bank and the IMF became hugely influential, advising and lending to countries transitioning away from socialism.
And politically.
Liberal democracy was promoted as the best way to organize political life.
Okay, and the third major consequence?
Simply the emergence of many new countries. All the former Soviet republics, the Eastern European states, they were all independent now, each with its own path to choose.
Like the Baltic states and Eastern Europe looking towards the EU and NATO?
Exactly. They quickly oriented themselves westward.
Whereas Central Asia had different options.
Yes. Given their location and resources, they tried to balance ties with Russia, the West, China, West Asia. So the international system suddenly had many new players, new interests, new challenges.
Now, for most of these new countries, the shift from the old system wasn't smooth, was it? The source talks about a painful transition.
Extremely painful for many. And the main model adopted, often pushed by those international institutions like the World Bank and IMF, was called shock therapy.
Shock therapy. Sounds abrupt. What did it involve?
It was meant to be a total, immediate shift. Root out everything Soviet, establish capitalism overnight. That meant mass privatization of state companies and assets, breaking up collective farms for private farming.
No gradual change allowed.
No.
Yeah.
The source is clear. It ruled out any alternate or third way. It had to be a sudden, complete break.
And externally, how did their connections change?
Also sudden and complete. Switch to free trade, encourage foreign investment, deregulate finance, make currencies convertible. The old trade links within the Soviet bloc were just severed.
So cut ties with each other, connect directly to the West instead.
That was the idea. Get absorbed into the Western economic system, guided by Western states and institutions.
Right. Now, the crucial question, did this shock therapy actually work? Did it bring the promised prosperity?
According to the source, no. Not in the short term, anyway. It's pretty blunt. Shock therapy did not bring a utopia of mass consumption. Instead, for most of the 1990s, it brought ruin to the economies and disaster upon the people.
Wow. So the shock was definitely there, but maybe not so much therapy.
That's a fair way to put it, based on the source. In Russia, for example, that huge state-industrial complex just collapsed. About 90% of industries were put up for sale.
And without a plan.
Right. Market forces alone meant whole industries just vanished.
And that phrase used to describe the privatization.
The largest garage sale in history. Valuable assets were sold off incredibly cheaply. Ordinary people got vouchers for shares, but most needed cash, so they sold them for almost nothing.
What did this mean for everyday life?
Real hardship. The Russian ruble's value collapsed. Massive inflation wiped out savings, collective farms broke up, leading to food shortages. Russia actually had to import food.
And the overall economy shrank.
Dramatically. The source states Russia's real GDP in 1999 was lower than in 1989, before the collapse. The old system was gone. Nothing effective replaced it quickly.
What about the social safety net? Subsidies, welfare?
Pretty much destroyed. Subsidies were withdrawn. Huge numbers fell into poverty. The middle class was hit hard. Academics, intellectuals. Many left or couldn't find work.
And this created space for crime.
Yes, the source explicitly says a mafia emerged in most countries, controlling parts of the economy, adding to the chaos.
And did privatization create equality?
Quite the opposite. It led to new disparities.
Yeah.
Huge gaps between rich and poor regions and massive inequality between people. You got the rise of the oligarchs alongside widespread poverty.
What about the political side? Did democracy flourish easily?
Not automatically.
Yeah.
The source suggests the focus on rapid economic change often meant building democratic institutions took a back seat. Constitutions were written fast, often giving presidents huge power, weakening parliaments.
Leading to authoritarianism in some places.
Definitely. Central Asia is given as an example, presidents appointing themselves for life, crushing dissent, establishing independent courts, rule of law. That was a slow, difficult process everywhere.
But the economies did eventually start to recover.
Yes, the source notes things began to turn around, especially in Russia, around 2000, about a decade later.
What drove the recovery?
Mostly natural resources, oil, gas, minerals. Countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan benefited hugely from exports. Others got money from pipelines crossing their land. Manufacturing also started to slowly rebuild in some areas.
Okay, so some economic revival eventually. But the source also warns that many of these former Soviet states remain prone to conflict.
Yes, that's a major point. The region has seen numerous civil wars, insurgencies since '91, and outside powers getting involved often makes things worse.
Can you give some examples from the source?
Well, within Russia itself, there were violent secessionist movements in Chechnya and Dagestan. Moscow used heavy military force, leading to accusations of human rights abuses, but didn't entirely end the independence drive.
And elsewhere.
Tajikistan had a terrible civil war for 10 years. There are sectarian conflicts. Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan is a major flashpoint with Armenia. Georgia had civil wars over breakaway regions.
And there have been popular movements against regimes, too. Plus disputes over resources like water.
Right. Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia have seen movements against governments. And fights over shared rivers add to the instability. It makes life very difficult. The source also highlights Central Asia as a key area of geopolitical competition now, because of those energy resources and its location.
Bordering Russia, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Close to West Asia.
Exactly. And post 9/11, the U.S. got very interested needing bases, overflight rights for Afghanistan and Iraq.
While Russia sees it as its backyard.
Yes, it's near abroad, as the source mentions. Russia wants to maintain influence there.
And China is interested too.
Increasingly, for energy, trade, and security along its borders, so it's a complex mix of interests.
And thinking wider than the former USSR, Yugoslavia's breakup was also incredibly violent, wasn't it?
Extremely violent. Unlike Czechoslovakia, which split peacefully, Yugoslavia disintegrated into brutal ethnic conflicts after 1991. Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia declared independence.
Which led to war.
Yes, ethnic Serbs opposed it, leading to horrific massacres, especially of Bosnians. Eventually, NATO intervened with bombing campaigns. It was a terrible period.
Okay, so a really complex and often tragic aftermath. Let's shift focus now. How did a country like India handle this massive global shift?
Well, the source says India actually managed to maintain good relations with pretty much all the post-communist countries.
But the relationship with Russia remains special.
Very much so. The source stresses it's still a cornerstone of India's foreign policy, built on a history of trust and common interests, and it goes both ways, positive feelings among the public too.
And there's that cultural connection mentioned.
Yeah, it's a fascinating detail. Indian film stars like Raj Kapoor, Amitabh Bachchan, still hugely popular in Russia and many other post-Soviet places. Hindi films, the songs, they're part of the popular memory.
Didn't the source mention something specific about Uzbekistan?
Right. A BBC report finding shops selling pirated Indian movies, Uzbek officials, and ordinary people knowing Hindi film songs by heart, even without understanding the words. It shows how deep those cultural roots run.
Beyond culture, though, India and Russia see eye to eye on the world order.
They share a vision, yes. The source calls it a multipolar world order.
What does that mean for them?
Basically, a world with several major powers coexisting. They emphasize collective security, more regional cooperation, settling disputes through negotiation, not force. They want independent foreign policies for all countries and a stronger, more democratic UN.
And this is formalized.
Yes, through things like the 2001 Indo-Russian Strategic Agreement and over 80 bilateral deals covering various areas.
How does India benefit from this strong tie with Russia?
Several ways, according to the source. Support on issues like Kashmir, access to energy supplies, sharing intelligence on terrorism. It helps India access Central Asia, and it provides a balance in India's relationship with China.
And what's in it for Russia?
India is a huge market, particularly for arms. It's Russia's second largest. Most of India's military gear still comes from Russia. Russia has helped India with energy security in the past, and India wants more energy imports from Russia and Central Asia.
Any other areas of cooperation?
Yes, joint projects in oil fields. Russia's been crucial for India's nuclear power program and its space ambitions, like providing cryogenic rocket technology when others wouldn't. They also work together on scientific projects.
It's clear those old Cold War ties really laid the foundation. The source briefly mentions that history.
Just for context, yeah. It reminds us India had this broad relationship with the USSR before 1991. Economic aid for India's public sector, political backing on Kashmir and during the 1971 war, military supplies, and those cultural links we talked about. It wasn't starting from scratch.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. From that powerful image of the Berlin Wall falling, setting everything off, we looked at the Soviet system, its initial strengths, but also those deep, fatal weaknesses.
We unpacked Gorbachev's reforms and how, kind of ironically, they triggered the very collapse they were meant to prevent.
We dug into the core reasons for the disintegration, the really tough transition period that followed that shock therapy and the messy consequences, including ongoing conflicts.
And then we looked at how India navigated this new world, especially maintaining that strong historic relationship with Russia based on shared interests and a view of how the world should work.
Yeah, the key takeaways seem to be the incredible speed of the collapse itself, the really difficult, unequal economic transition afterwards, the shift to that U.S.-dominated unipolar moment, and all the new geopolitical complexities and instability that emerged.
Absolutely. This wasn't just some historical event. It fundamentally reshaped the global system. Politics, economics, power dynamics. The ripples are still felt very strongly today.
And maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with, something the source itself hints at. The Soviet collapse might not be the last time a major political system fails. So what lessons can we draw from this whole story?
That's the big question, isn't it? Lessons about maybe failing to meet people's basic needs and aspirations, about ignoring deep internal problems, or about the dangers of rapid, externally driven transitions like shock therapy.
How relevant are those lessons for understanding other major shifts happening in the world today? How much does the legacy of this whole period still shape the global landscape, maybe in ways we don't always see? Something to think about.